Well, hello everyone. Welcome to hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for one moment. Sorry, folks. Hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's another of all things. It's another of our All Things Canada edition, and we welcome back to the show our dear friend and returning champion. He's one of my favorite peoples, Yves Engler, Canadian historian, journalist, media critic, NGO critic, anti-imperialist, activist, and thinker, member of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, host of the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and Talking Foreign Policy, which is part of the CFPI. He is a member of Disruption Canada, former NDP leadership candidate who was shamefully and wrongfully barred from entering the race, and he's the author of several books, Playing Left Wing, From Rink Rat to Student Radical, Canada and Haiti, Waging War on the Poor Majority with Anthony Fenton, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, Canada and Israel, Building Apartheid, Stop Signs, Cars, and Capitalism on the Road to Economic, Social, and Ecological Decay, which he did with Bianca Mugyenyi, his wife, and also part of the also wonderful leftist. Lester Pearson's Peacekeeping, The Truth May Hurt, The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy, Canada and Africa, 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation, A Propaganda System, How Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation, Left Right, Margins, The Beat of Imperial Canada, House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy, Stand on Guard from Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military, and his latest is Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, which he co-wrote with Owen Shalk. He's my guest for the strict 30 minutes or so I got him. First off, Yves, my man, one of my favorite peoples. So welcome back, and how's it going?
It's going pretty well. How about
It's
yourself?
I'm doing good, Eve, and it's an honor to have you. I believe it's the first time I've had you since you well, the last time I had you on was with Barry, and you were still trying to, enter the NTP leadership race. And this is the first time I've had you on since I did an epic, very well received episode with your comrades, folks that were in your campaign team, Jasmine Pearson and Zach Roudier, where we spent 2 hours defending you and Bianca against the smear merchants and the hate merchants and and the controlled opposition left and so forth. So it's a real honor to have you back on. And yes,
Happy to be here.
excuse me.
Happy to be here.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, I hope you're well, my friend. And again, it's an honor to have you back on. And okay, let's get started. And one moment, and I just am going to put my yep my timer on. Okay, so Eve, first question I wanted to ask you. So I read your latest book a couple of weeks ago that you co-wrote with the equally brilliant Owen Shalk, who I've had on the show before, and it's a great, I would say, semi-sequel to your first book, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. And I think, and folks should still get this book, and because I think folks will learn more about Canadian imperialism in this book. And I think even if they might have already known the work you've done, Richard Sanders, Tyler Shipley, and the small but robust Canadian anti-imperialist organizations. This really still is a book worth. This really, it still is a book worth getting. So, first question I want to ask you is: let's first talk about two countries which Canada sabotaged democracy and supported the most far right reactionary movements, and that is Russia in the 90s. Although arguably Canada has been at war with Russia since the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War. But let's talk about Russia in the 90s following the dissolution of what I strongly think was a more color revolution and counter revolution in Russia and Eastern Europe, the dissolution of the USSR. Talk to us about Canada and Russia in the 90s.
Well, I think in the 90s, Canada was supportive of the efforts to sell off government assets and prop up Yeltsin, and they basically wanted to see the weakening of Russia, and obviously they supported the demise of the Soviet Union, and which did provide some check to U.S. NATO domination of the world. And so there was a support by Mulroney specifically to basically prop up Yeltsin, and also kind of concurrent with that was a push for support for NATO expansion, which was something that was supposed to not to happen after the as part of the agreement um, to end the Cold War.
And allow
But
Germany to reunify.
yeah, exactly, and to withdraw troops and stuff from East Germany, and so that was a Canadian policy, and that Canadian policy on the NATO front uh, just continued throughout the 2000s, and even while Putin tried to kind of reverse some of the disintegration of the Russian state, the Canadian government didn't necessarily like that, but specifically it alongside obviously Washington, it pressed its geopolitical advantage and pushed NATO expansion further eastward and right on to Russia's border.
And talk a bit more about so Canada under Brian Mulroney and certainly under Kim Campbell during her brief period, and then later Kretsen did support Yeltsin, who was, I mean, mobbed up doesn't even begin to describe him, but he was very much a market fundamentalist, like very much like fiscally reactionary, neoliberal, libertarian, and so forth. And the policies had the mass privatization, the mass deindustrialization, the mass overturning of workers' rights and so forth was very devastating for the Russian people. Social mobility simply collapsed. The lifespan of people collapsed dramatically, and then you had the rise of vicious organized crime, and then very dodgy politicians and so forth. At one point, the opposition, not just communist opposition, but just the opposition in general, a broad opposition, tried to stop these crazy voodoo economics, junk economics. There was even a fist fight, and I think at one point they were the Duma looks like it was very clear that they were going to stop just this crazy, endless, bloodshed of austerity. And then Yeltsin sent the army, fired at the Duma, killed some people, arrested the opposition, and afterwards he gave himself more presidential powers. And this was with the blessing of the United States, but also Canada, as the book talks about. Talk a bit more about that, and also the nefarious meddling and manipulation of voters that got Yeltsin reelected.
Yeah, well, you probably know the details better than I do, but there was this parliamentary sort of self coup where Yeltsin actually, fires on the Duma, and this is in '93, and apparently hundreds of people are killed. I don't think there's a confirmed number, but Canada just in response to this, Canada doubles down on its backing of Yeltsin and significant assistance, visits for Canadian diplomats, and so the government, basically it applauds the subversion of Russian democracy on behalf of privatization, weakening of the Russian state, and obviously the rise of these, what we now gets discussed as the oligarchs, right? Which who benefited from the sell off of the state assets and the stripping of the rights that common people, working class people had during communist times. And so, yeah, I mean, it's the U.S. plays a substantive role in it, and Canada is right there alongside, assisting in that push, which is, it fits. We discussed this. Owen Shalk and I discussed this a bit in our book, Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy. It fits with the pattern all across the world, where this is not the far from one of the more egregious examples of Canada just backing the undercutting of democracy. The maybe more well-known or more definitive example in Ukraine in 2014. Um, Canada played a much more central role, but there's the consistent pattern is where the U.S. is backing the overthrow of democracy. Canada assists it, and in this case, I don't think that Yeltsin's policy, Russia was a more powerful country, so it's not like Haiti where Canada and the U.S. are like they're central players, and there is no coup if there is not the U.S. and Canada's involvement. I don't think Yeltsin was more of his own man, if you like, right, than in other scenarios, but nonetheless, Canada positioned itself very clearly in favor of a murderous effort to subvert parliamentary democracy on behalf of privatization.
My follow-up question, you already mentioned Ukraine. So my follow-up question, the second official question, is Ukraine and the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan storming of the barricades that saw, however imperfect, but he was democratically elected, however imperfect, Viktor Yanukovych flees, and of course all the hideous events that culminated in a civil war in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, and then later Russia's invasion or special military operation against the NATO EU backed Zelensky's government of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, in the Ukraine, Canada has been very important player. Like I think people kind of somewhat underestimate how significant Canada's been, and this predates the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Canada assisted that. You got like CBC International or Radio Canada International pumping in. This goes back to like I think it's 1950 or early 50s, a Ukraine section and pumping in sort of anti-Soviet Ukrainian nationalist kind of news and broadcasting. And then you have like the setting up of the second Ukrainian Studies Department, which is at the University of Alberta in Edmonton back in I think it's in 75 or 76. And so there's this significant Canadian involvement in Ukraine, and basically just trying to bring the Ukraine away from the Russian orbit and towards NATO, Western Europe, North America, whatnot. And in 2004, there is this so-called Orange Revolution, and Canada plays a very important role. There's a Globe Mail story about it where that Thomas McKinnon, I think is his name. He discusses how the Canadian ambassador was organizing all the different Western ambassadors meeting to support the opponents of the government, in favor of the Orange Revolution, which was oddly enough, it was Viktor Yanukovych was the the who later wins the election in 2010, he's viewed as he's the one targeted in the 2004 election by the Orange Revolution forces. And so basically, Canada's working, backing the opposition groups in this protest movement, which becomes dubbed the Orange Revolution. It's successful in a narrow sense, but the political project basically collapses after they win the election.
Also
Um,
also important caveat. Sorry to interrupt, but the guy who was supposedly poisoned by Putin or Putin's or Putin's backed candidate. These are the words, of course, of Western propaganda. But apparently, his policy when it came to the linguistics of Ukraine, because the west of Ukraine mostly speaks Ukrainian, east of Ukraine, speaks both Russian and Ukrainian, but very largely, Ukrainians of a Russian-speaking background. And apparently, that guy that was poisoned, the West's best friend in the Orange
Yushchenko.
Revolution, Yushchenko. He actually wanted to make Ukrainian the only official language, including his two successors, whereas Viktor Yanukovych wanted to, make Ukraine, just like officially, bilingual, Ukrainian, Russian, and, anyone who spoke Polish and so forth. I think that's an important thing to add, before we talk about all the stuff you're about to talk about.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's exactly the backdrop to the 2014 coup. So in 2010, Canada has large numbers of electoral observers that oversee the election as they'd done in previous elections, and they're all anti-Yanukovych. They're all, or basically all, half of them are official Canadian government ones, and half of them are a certain number of them are from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which is very much aligned with the Western Ukraine, geographically speaking, and Western oriented elements in the Ukrainian political life. And so, but Yanukovych wins, and the Canadian electoral observers, basically say this is a legitimate election. We don't like who won, but it was legit, and which makes it clear that it was very clearly that was the case. And but immediately the Harper government works to undercut Yanukovych. And there's a series of things. Harper makes a visit to the country where he does this provocative move where he goes to a monument in Lviv that's to like sort of hardline nationalists. Um, and he it's like a museum, I believe it was, and he does an event there, and it's sort of viewed as trying to undercut Yanukovych. And then Bev Oda, the ambassador in 2011, 2012, another visit, and Canada's funding opposition. And throughout all this period is basically a whole bunch of statements, ultimately introduces some sanctions later in 2013. The head of the or the spokesperson for Canada's embassy in Ukraine is a leading activist in the Maidan movement, the movement against Yanukovych. And then ultimately, the Canadian embassy gets used in Kyiv, just not far from Maidan Square, gets used as a base of opposition for over a week by the opposition forces that ultimately, in the week before the toppling of Yanukovych, uh, John Baird makes a visit to Maidan Square in early December, a couple months before Yanukovych is overthrown. So Canada has its hands all over the destabilization and the ouster of Yanukovych. And then immediately there's a big aid package that Canada puts up and multiple visits by John Baird and Harper, all within like a 6 week period. I think there's like three visits by the Canadian foreign minister or prime minister, very short period of time. So really aggressive diplomatic support to prop up the post-coup forces. And then that, of course, leads to the civil war in the east of the country. It leads to Russia seizing Crimea. It
Because Poroshenko was a hard line Ukrainian nationalist. Only the Ukrainian language will be spoken, as well as oh, you still there, Eve?
Yeah, yeah. I mean
Oh yeah.
the language stuff is the language stuff is part of it, but the I think the more fundamental policy from the Canadian perspective was that Yanukovych called for neutrality, right? He had neutrality in the Constitution, which just means that Ukraine can't join NATO. And that was what was, I think the what's objectionable from the geostrategists in Ottawa and the US. I don't think the language thing just kind of overlapped with that geopolitical question, but the basic issue was uh, turning Ukraine into a I don't know, a proxy, into a anti-Russia state, obviously on Russia's border, and NATO, either joining NATO at the maximalist end, which the Harper government backed in 2008 at that infamous NATO conference in Bucharest, even against the Germans and the French position, but in alignment with the U.S. And so that's what the kind of the central issue was for the Canadian officials, and then and the coup in 2014 leads precisely to that process of the NATOization of Ukrainian military, and I can get into more detail on that if you want. But the 2014 is absolutely definitive to understanding the horrible war that Russia instigates in February 2022.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Ukraine before we go to Iran, which is didn't Yanukovych? It's amazing how much propaganda, the avalanche of propaganda we got about the Yanukovych government and what really happened at Euromaidan, where it was depicted as him being, gunning peaceful protesters, when actually a lot of the protesters were people from Sevboda and the right sector. These are like ultra nationalist Ukrainians, linguistic supremacists, and people who lionize Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera and so forth, like that. Shocking that, not shocking if you read Richard Sanders' work, but Chrystia Freeland and the Ukrainian, very well-funded Ukrainian expat groups like the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, also founded by runaway Nazi war criminals and so forth. Those were the folks that were being supported in this supposedly liberal, progressive, left-leaning Euromaidan movement. And Yanukovych actually, while he was interested in joining the European Union, when he saw the fine details of mass privatization, more austerity, and so forth, he then got cold feet, and then it was later depicted as him being, belligerent and Putin's puppet, and then poof comes, the coup, the storming of the barricades, and him having to flee the country. Of course, this is not depicted when anyone watches the CBC, Euro News, Dutch, German, Italian, French, Belgian, state media or corporate media. Your response to that before we get to Iran?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly correct. It was there was a complicated geopolitical and economic. There's a divide economically within Ukraine where, particularly in the Donbass, they had more economic ties to Russia, and they were, if you just look at the map and the geography of all, they're never going to be as big of, trading partners with Poland as it would be in the west of the country, just for obvious geographic reasons. And so, and the whole kind of neoliberal policy that came with the EU was also particularly damaging for pensioners and stuff like that in the East. And so yeah, that I mean that's the context. It's a much more murky politics than the way it's framed in our media, which is just this sort of one-sided. I do want to say that right after the coup, like there is an effort to end the civil war in early 2015,
Yeah.
and ultimately they come up with the Minsk two accords, and Canada works immediately, basically undercut this, which it was agreed to by the Security Council, and the whole Operation Unifier of training the Ukrainian forces is basically Canada backing this low-level civil war with Russia, and it's sort of done at a proxy level in the East. But that's what Canada is doing, and it's basically designed to undercut Kyiv moving forward with the what it had agreed to in Minsk Accords. And so, this is some of the context that's important, but ultimately, I think that what's going on in Iran right now is more important in the moment.
Let's talk about anyways, long story short, evil. This awful war in Ukraine did not start with Russia's military invasion. It started because of Western imperialism, a Western-backed coup, a Western-backed hardline Ukrainian nationalist oppressing his fellow Ukrainians of a Russian-speaking background. Zelensky's supposed to come in and bring peace, love, and happiness, but no longer really has control over his over his country, and that of course led to Russia's invasion, which both you and I don't agree with, but we do understand the rationale and so forth. And now let's talk about the history of Canada meddling in Iranian affairs. Take it away, Yves.
Well, I mean, I think that the 2 points that are important right now is that Canada is assisting the U.S.-Israeli war. It's assisting it through NORAD intelligence gathering. It's assisting it through Canadians that are part of U.S. units, small number, but nonetheless in the region. It's assisting it through probably Canada's base. It's assisting it through the communication security establishment, intelligence sharing, and obviously like weapon sales to the U.S. And then we could get into and all kinds of military courts. The U.S. just reported that all the U.S. planes have been flying over Canada and refueling in Canada. So there's a whole bunch of forms of Canadian complicity. But even if all those were kind of left aside, Canada has assisted in this war through its policy of isolating Iran diplomatically and weakening it financially. And
Well,
since
but it
20,
doesn't. But it doesn't start there. I mean, Canada supported the overthrow, the Anglo-American coup against Mossadegh, who was secular, who was a socialist, who was democratically elected under a constitutional monarch. Canada overthrows Mossadegh in favor of the Anglo-American oil interests and so forth like that. Supports the Shah, who becomes an absolute monarch, who's very oppressive to his people, who I mean, we can compliment some policies he did, which were socially liberal and were feminist, but he was basically a grotesque capitalist, and that leads to a revolution, which the Islamists hijack and yeah. Talk about that before we talk about current affairs. Actually,
yeah, I just want to finish though with the current part of it. So Canada's trying to, it broke off diplomatic relations 15 years ago. Unlike the UK and France that have diplomatic relations, put Iran on its state sponsor of terrorism list back in 2012. Just about 2 years ago, it put the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on the terrorism list, which is part of Iran's military. It's allowed for this theft of Iranian assets in this country in contravention of international law. So it's really worked to isolate and to target Iran. So it's provided some of the basis that enables the U.S. and Israel to do what they've been doing. Now, what you point out is exactly correct, which is that the history of Canada's relations with Iran are supporting the British, who have major oil interests in the country dating back to the 1920s, 30s, and then British Petroleum when Mossadegh becomes a leader, he tries to get a bit better deal from British Petroleum, which is making huge profits in the country, and BP just basically says no, and so it in response, they ultimately nationalized the company. Lester Pearson in the House of Commons in 51 is complaining about this effort to get more greater share of the resources by the Iranian government of its oil wealth. And then Canada supports the UK-led embargo of oil as a way to undermine Mossadegh, and then it supports passively the coup in 53. We set up diplomatic relations formally in 1955, so not long after the coup, and there's a number of internal government documents where Canadian officials are, endorsing U.S. and British policy. And then we basically strengthen ties with the Shah that's put in power over the next 26 years. Right until like in 78, you have Bill Davis, the Premier of Ontario, who goes to Iran and you sell weapons to Iran, and it's not like it's not the closest relations of any country, but it's significant business relations and totally open diplomatic ties. And then there's the Iranian Revolution, and we cut off diplomatic relations the next year in 1980, and then those don't exist for a decade. We sell weapons to Saddam when he launches this war against Iran. And then, as I mentioned, sort of relations sort of improve a little bit in the 90s. Never, good relations, but they sort of improve, and there's some business ties, and there's a certain amount of diaspora relations, Iranian Canadians and stuff. And then the sort of hostility picks up in the 2000s, the mid 2000s, and ultimately Harper cuts off diplomatic ties in 2012.
Well,
So
it was a Canadian. It was a Canadian, David Frum, the speechwriter of George W. Bush, who put Iran as the axe on the axis of evil, along with North Korea and Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
for sure, and so yeah, it's there's a um, there's a hostility to Iran's challenge of U.S. and Israeli dominance in the region, and that's sort of continues right till today, where you have immediately Mark Carney endorsed the U.S.-Israeli war, and then we've had all these musings about assisting the U.S. and Israel through dispatching naval vessels. I'm doubtful if to open up the Strait of Hormuz. I'm doubtful if it will transpire because the public is so critical of this war, and because Donald Trump is so incoherent in his public relations, his messaging around the war, and he makes all kinds of wild comments that like we're gonna keep bombing Karg Island just for the fun of it, as he put it a week ago or so. So that's obviously hard for a liberal Canadian or Labour government in the UK to get formally tied to, because it's just Trump is so all over the place. But yeah, Canada is clearly assisting this war, and also should note that like we treat Israel in this totally special way, where we don't even uphold our own laws vis-a-vis Israel, as it launches genocide in Gaza, as it kills over 1,000 of Lebanon, and of course as it's instigated this devastating war in Iran. And we also, of course, have hundreds of military accords with the U.S. military that's the other major belligerent in this war. So Canada is very much a major player, supporter of the Anglo Zionist imperial onslaught against Iran.
Can I squeeze three quick questions out of you?
For sure, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so your response to the hidden history of the US, France, Germany, Britain, you mentioned Canada and its allies grooming Ayatollah Khomeini, then turning on him while the West and the USSR supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the war against the Islamic Republic. And while all that was going on, while Canada was supporting, along with the US, and the USSR, Saddam Hussein's aggression towards Iran, Israel was supporting and defying the West, and actually was supporting Khomeini in his defense and his offensive attacks on Saddam Hussein. And it's interesting because the Iran-Contra scandal, Israel actually was a middleman in that whole humongous scandal where the U.S. was secretly giving weapons to the Iranians, even though they were supporting Saddam Hussein, also that they can continue their illegal genocidal war against the Daniel Ortega Sandinista government in Nicaragua. I'm very curious your response to that.
My response is I just truly don't know enough about the history to have any insight. So I trust your depiction. It's not the fact that there is, it's multi-layered makes sense to me. But I don't know enough to know to have much of a comment.
Yeah, I just think it's crazy. I mean, it's controversial to say this amongst anti-imperialist circles because I do agree 100% unconditional solidarity to the Islamic Republic of Iran as they resist Western imperial aggression and fight for the sovereignty of all nations and whatnot. But I just don't. But I do challenge the thesis that the Islamic Republic of Iran was always on the front line against Western imperialism when it was actually Western imperialism that helped Ayatollah Khomeini get into power, mainly through France, Germany, Jimmy Carter himself, and so forth. And then, of course, you had the Ronald Reagan administration sabotaging efforts to release American hostages in Iran, saying to Ayatollah Khomeini, like, don't release the hostages yet until I become president. And then because the moment like Ayatollah Khomeini starts talking about anti-Zionism and you guys need to actually pay more for the oil that we allow you to exploit, then the West completely turns on the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I just find that just yeah, darkly amusing and just so scandalous. But then a very quick second last question then is this: doesn't both Russia, Ukraine, and all the stuff I just said about Iran, but doesn't Russia, Ukraine, and Iran make the strong case that going forward, the anti-imperialist ethos in international relations is your first do no harm, and whatever unfortunate government, be it Putin's Russia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and whatever sectarian Western leftist team, Stalinist communist states, we must practice careful non-interventionism and understand Western imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is to blame for all of this. And the best we can do is to make sure our ghastly imperial mobsters don't make things worse. And one could argue this goes for Afghanistan, the West backing the feudalistic bin Ladens of the world, and later the Taliban, and then later our support for rival warlords, equally ghoulish in Afghanistan, and drug lords and people who engage in child abuse. So again, doesn't all of that make the case of what you always are advocating as an anti-imperialist? First, do no harm.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say that, Western imperialism is responsible for all of these problems. I think that the Western imperialism is the central power structure in the U.S. empire that's sort of uh, imposing or undercutting the world's ability and most of the world's ability to better themselves economically, socially, politically. But I think that the main point for the a Canadian audience specifically is that we can principally control what we can control. And we can control the political culture, the government policies that our government is pursuing. Um, even if you looked at the Ukraine and you were like you apportioned, I don't know, let's just say for sake of discussion, 75% of the negative foreign intervention to be Russia and 25 to be, divvied up between Washington, Canada, Germany, whatever. Um, if you're in Canada, you don't you can't have much impact on the Russian side of the equation. That's not how I wouldn't. That's not how I look at the issue and apportion the uh, the nefarious foreign intervention. But if you even if you did and do it that way, then your focus should be on Canada and there's just more than enough evidence and examples of the Canadian government, Canadian uh, corporations, the political culture in this country, undercutting freedom, using countries as proxies, and so yeah, I think the conclusion is that we are not a benevolent force in Ukraine or in Russia for that matter. You mentioned the history. I mean, in the case of Russia, the history is actually longer. I mean, Canada
Mhm.
dispatched troops to the Crimean War in the mid 1850s to support the British in that policy. And then, as you pointed out, after the Russian Revolution, we dispatched all these troops to try to crush um, the Bolsheviks. And then we immediately worked. We had a short period of time when we broke off relations for a significant period of time, and then there was a short period of time during World War II where there was some détente. But yeah, Canada has it is looked at Russia through the lens of the British Empire, which is as a geopolitical competitor, historically the British Empire, and then more recently through the lens of the U.S. Empire. And so there's conclusions that come from that in terms of whether people should be supporting Canadian policy. And just as a general rule, I do think that the first do no harm has to be on the agenda of the left in understanding foreign policy. It's not always easy. It's not always, totally clean, but there's just too many examples of Canada intervening in a nefarious way, undercutting, and invariably there's some high-minded rationale for that. Be that the bombing of Libya in 2011, be that recent stuff on Iran and the protesters and the repressive nature. There's always a
Syria,
high.
Syria, which often gets completely criminally overlooked when it shouldn't, because it's also the victim of Western imperialism.
Yeah, and so
Oh,
there's just this constant pattern. So people really need to focus on withdrawal rather than more Canada in the world.
well, I think that's a perfect place to end. And what a shame that we don't have somebody like you in the NDP leadership race, or somebody like a Bianca in the NDP leadership race, right, Yves?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the whole thing with genuine internationalism, anti-militarism, anti-imperialism is deeply marginalized in the political culture.
Well, well, we continue the fights. We will continue the struggle regardless. Well, well. Folks, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One with one of my favorite peoples, Yves Engler. Let me remind folks, Canadian historian, journalist, media critic, NGO critic, anti-imperialist activist and thinker, member of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, host of Canadian Foreign Policy Hour and Talking Foreign Policy, which is part of the CFPI, member of Disruption Canada, former NDP leadership candidate who was shamefully and wrongfully barred from entering the race. And again, author of several books, Plain Left Wing, from Rink Rat to Student Radical, Canada and Haiti, waging a war on the poor majority with Anthony Fenton, Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, Canada and Israel Building Apartheid, Stop Science Cars, Capitalism on the Road to Ecological Decay, Lester Pearson's Foreign Policy, and many more, Stand on Guard for Whom, A People's History of the Canadian Military, and of course, Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, which he co-wrote with Owen Shalk. And reminder, folks, as always, do share widely all of One Plus One's content, past and present. Help share our playlists, help us overcome the far right algorithms and the dominant monopoly that Western corporate, state media, and pseudo-leftist websites have in the social media world by sharing our content across all social media and email. Please donate to One Plus One if you can at our PayPal, and if people would prefer a different form of donation, email me at yurismather@gmail. And Facebook sometimes blocks my ability to share One Plus One. So again, please share widely. And it helps the show immensely. And lastly, special request, please, if you can, folks, become a paid Patreon. It's my friend Chris Richards, who hosts the Eclectic Radical. Chris recently lost his job, and he's struggling to take care of his wife, who struggles with diabetes, and everybody knows how difficult that is in the U.S. So please become a paid Patreon to Chris. You're helping me out immensely, because we would like to do future trips to different parts of the world and do more on-ground journalism and in-person interviews. So again, if folks do donate to Chris, become a patron to him, it's money better spent than the overpriced streaming services, certainly Spotify. And so then, folks, have a good evening. Hands off Iran, Lebanon, free Syria. From Al Jalani, free Palestine, free Imran Khan, and BDS now, democratic, secular, one-state solution. Yves, once again, thanks for coming on the show. Good night and good luck, all right?
Thanks, Yuri. Thank you. Thanks. Take care.